The smell of smoked sausage cut through the cold morning air like a knife through Lucas's hunger. It was 6 o'clock in the morning at the Cedar Creek farmers market, and the first customers were still arriving when the 8-year-old boy emerged from the shadows between the stalls like a hungry ghost. His small, dirty fingers trembled, not just from the biting September cold, but from the hunger that had gnawed at his stomach for 3 days. His ribs showed beneath his torn and dirty t-shirt, stained with dirt and something that could have been blood from an old cut. His bare feet, calloused and wounded by stones and glass, stepped on the damp market ground with the desperate lightness of someone who had perfected the art of being invisible. Lucas had slept at the back door of a closed bakery, wrapped in wet newspapers he'd found in the trash. His sleep had been interrupted by the aggressive barking of stray dogs, fighting over the food scraps he himself was looking for. 3 nights. Ergo, another boy, an older, stronger kid called Rat, had stolen the last piece of bread Lucas had managed to beg for. Since then, nothing. Just cold water from a public faucet and the hope that today would be different. He watched the meat stall from afar, studying the movements of the robust vendor who was arranging sausages and pieces of chicken on aluminum trays. Robert Silva, 50 years old, graying hair and calloused hands that told stories of decades of hard work, whistled a country song while organizing his merchandise. Lucas didn't know the man's name, but he had observed his routine for weeks, memorizing every movement, every distraction. The strategy was simple. Wait for Robert to turn his back to get ice from the refrigerated truck. Reach out, grab a sausage, and disappear among the fruit stalls. 3 seconds. That's all he needed. Lucas's stomach contracted in a painful cramp that made him bend slightly. His hands trembled more. There was no more time for hesitation. Robert stepped away from the counter, walking toward the truck. Now. Lucas moved with the desperate agility of survival, sliding between 2 customers examining tomatoes. His fingers extended toward a large, fat sausage that seemed to glow under the yellowish light of the market lamps. "Hey, little thief!" The shout didn't come from Robert, but from Joe Martinez, a regular customer known for his impatience and bad temper. The 40-year-old man, wearing a blue polo shirt and carrying a leather briefcase, had seen Lucas approaching the counter. "Robert, there's a kid stealing your sausages." Lucas froze, his hand inches from the meat. Panic exploded in his chest like a rocket, sending adrenaline through his veins. His muscles tensed for the escape that had saved his life so many other times. "Get that kid!" Joe shouted louder, pointing at Lucas as if he were a dangerous animal. "Call the police. These street kids need to learn." But before Lucas could run, a large, calloused hand gently landed on his shoulder. Not with force, not with anger, but with a gentleness that the boy hadn't felt for so long he had forgotten it was possible. "Easy, Joe," said Robert, positioning himself between the irritated customer and the terrified boy. His voice was low but firm, carrying a natural authority that came from years of resolving conflicts. "The kid's just hungry." "Hungry?" Joe huffed, indignant. "That's an excuse for stealing. My dad gave me some good spankings when I was a kid, and look how I turned out right." "Your dad also gave you food every day," Robert responded calmly, his eyes still fixed on Lucas. "When was the last time you ate, boy?" Lucas looked between the 2 men, his heart beating so hard he was sure they could hear it. Robert had clear blue eyes that reminded him of the sky on summer days, and there was something in them that Lucas couldn't decipher. Something that wasn't anger or disgust or pity. It was something softer, warmer. I wasn't stealing," Lucas murmured, the words coming out as a whisper. Robert let out a low laugh without irony. "Of course you were, and you're good at it. Almost made it." He crouched down to the boy's height, ignoring Joe, who continued grumbling about bums and lack of discipline. "What's your name?" "Lucas." "Lucas what?" The boy looked down. There was no what. There was no last name, no family. Nothing but Lucas and the hunger that followed him like a shadow. "Just Lucas," he said finally. Robert studied the boy's face, the cheekbones too prominent, the eyes too big for his small head, the yellowish skin that betrayed malnutrition. There was something familiar in those eyes, a hunger that went far beyond an empty stomach. Robert had grown up on these same streets decades ago, before luck, hard work, and a stranger's generosity gave him the opportunity to build a better life. "Sit here," said Robert. indicating a plastic stool behind the counter. "Maria," he called to a robust woman working at the candy stall next door. "Bring a plate for the boy." Joe shook his head in disapproval. "You're encouraging vagrancy, Robert. Pretty soon you'll have a line of street kids here asking for food." "Then I'll feed a line of street kids," Robert replied simply, keeping his eyes on Lucas. "Will it hurt more in my pocket or my conscience?" Maria Silva, Robert's wife of 25 years, appeared carrying a paper plate with 2 sausage sandwiches, a slice of cornbread, and a glass of milk. She was a 45-year-old woman, round and maternal, with dark hair pulled back in a bun and brown eyes that shone with natural kindness. When she saw Lucas, her maternal heart ached. "Jesus, Robert," she murmured softly. "Look at the state of this boy." Lucas ate as if it were his last meal. In fact, for him, there was always the possibility that it might be. Each bite was desperate, each sip of milk a small salvation. Robert and Maria watched in silence, occasionally exchanging glances loaded with the nonverbal communication that comes from decades of marriage. "Slow down, son," said Maria gently when Lucas began to choke. "The food won't run away." But Lucas couldn't slow down. His body had learned that hesitation meant losing the opportunity. That trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Where do you sleep, Lucas?" asked Robert when the boy finally slowed down. Lucas gestured vaguely toward downtown. "Around there. And your parents?" The boy stopped eating for a moment, his eyes filling with an old pain. "Don't have any." The brutal simplicity of the response hit Robert like a punch to the stomach. There was no self-pity, no plea for help, just a fact stated with the naturalness of someone who had accepted a reality impossible to change. Maria approached and gently wiped Lucas's mouth with a napkin. "How old are you, honey?" 8. 8 years living on the streets. Robert calculated quickly. Lucas had probably been alone since he was 5 or 6. Years old, maybe younger. The math was too brutal to contemplate for long. "Do you want to see our ranch?" Robert asked impulsively, surprised by his own words. He had helped street children before. A meal here, some coins there, but he had never made an invitation like this. Lucas looked up, suspicious. In his experience, adults who offered things almost always wanted something in return, and what they wanted usually hurt. "It's just to see," Robert continued quickly, reading the hesitation on the boy's face. "We have some animals you might like to meet. And Maria made a stew today that's left over." The mention of more food overcame suspicion. Lucas nodded timidly. Joe Martinez took his purchases and walked away, grumbling about irresponsibility and what the world was becoming. But Robert didn't care. There was something about that boy that touched him in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the recognition of a similar journey. Maybe it was simply the paternal instinct that he and Maria had never had the chance to express, since children had never come. "Come on, Lucas," said Robert, starting to put away his merchandise. "Let's go home." Robert's ranch was 15 miles from town, a 125-acre property that stretched across green hills dotted with oak trees and small creeks that wound between the pastures. When the yellow, rusty Ford F-150 stopped in front of the main house, a simple brick construction with a wide porch and red tile roof, Lucas got out slowly, his eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. He had never seen so much open space. He had never breathed such clean air that didn't smell of sewage, garbage, and desperation. He had never heard this kind of silence, not the dead and dangerous silence of the city at night, but the living silence of the countryside, punctuated by distant moos, the whisper of wind in the trees, and the singing of birds he didn't know existed. "It's big," said Lucas, his voice small before the immensity. 125 acres, said Robert with pride. "I bought this 20 years ago with money I saved working as a hand on other ranches, started with just 5 acres and 5 cows. Lucas didn't know exactly what acres were, but he could see it was much, much bigger than any place he had ever been. In the city, his world was limited to a few blocks, the safe territory where he knew every hiding place, every escape route, every potential danger. "Come on," said Robert, walking toward the corrals. "I want to introduce you to my work partners." The first corral housed about 30 head of Angus cattle, their dark bodies standing out against the green grass that stretched as far as the eye could see. Lucas had seen animals before, street dogs and cats mainly, and occasionally horses pulling carts downtown, but never creatures so large, so peaceful, so present. "They don't bite?" he asked, stopping at a safe distance from the wooden fence. "No, they're gentle," Robert laughed. "Look here." He extended his hand and a cow approached, letting itself be petted. "This one here is Mocha. She's the leader of the herd, very intelligent." Lucas watched, fascinated, as Robert talked to the cows as if they were people, calling them by name, commenting on their personalities and peculiarities. There was something hypnotic about the way they moved, slow and deliberate, their large, expressive eyes seeming to understand more than they should. "Do you name all of them?" asked Lucas. Robert hesitated for a moment as if he had been caught at something. "Well, most of them." He scratched Mocha behind the ear. "It's kind of an addiction. My wife always says I'm too sentimental." What Robert didn't say, what he never told anyone, was the golden rule that his own boss had taught him decades ago. Never name animals you're going to eat. Otherwise it gets hard when the time comes. It was a lesson he had learned the most painful way possible, but one he now tried to forget whenever possible. A young heifer, only a few months old, separated from the group and walked to the fence. She had a white spot perfectly drawn in the shape of a star on her forehead, contrasting with the grayish hair of the rest of her body. The heifer looked directly at Lucas, tilting her head as if asking a silent question. Something stirred in Lucas's chest, a sensation he couldn't name. It was as if the heifer was recognizing him, choosing him somehow. "That one's special," said Robert, noticing the interaction. "Born 4 months ago, Mocha's daughter. I haven't chosen a name for her yet." Lucas approached slowly, extending his hesitant hand. The heifer sniffed his fingers and then licked his palm with her rough, warm tongue. The boy let out a laugh, the first real laugh in months, maybe years. "She likes you," observed Robert. "She has a star on her forehead," said Lucas, tracing the shape with his finger in the air. "She does. How about we call her Star?" Lucas nodded vigorously, a genuine smile lighting up his face for the first time Robert could remember. For the first time in his life, Lucas had named something. Something that was now, in a way, his. That night, at the kitchen table covered with a blue and white checkered tablecloth, Lucas ate until he couldn't anymore. Maria served him as if he were family. Rice, beans, beef stew, tomato salad, crispy cornbread, and a piece of homemade caramel fudge that melted in his mouth like a small explosion of happiness. The kitchen was a universe of new sensations. The smell of spices that Maria kept in glass jars lined up on the shelf, the comforting sound of the refrigerator humming softly in the corner, the warm light of the pendant lamp over the table that created a golden circle of safety. "You can sleep in the guest room tonight," said Robert, when Lucas began to doze in the chair, fighting against the weight of his first full meal in days. "Tomorrow we'll decide what to do." The room was small but clean, with a twin bed covered by a patchwork quilt that smelled of lavender and care. Lucas lay down dressed, still suspicious that all of this could disappear if he relaxed completely. His hands remained tense under the blanket, ready to react to any threat. But gradually, the warmth of the bed, the distant sound of Robert and Maria talking softly in the kitchen, and the strange but comforting feeling of being in a place where no one wanted to hurt him, began to dissolve. His defenses. For the first time in years, Lucas slept without starts, without needing to keep one ear alert for dangers. He woke to the sound of mooing and the aroma of fresh coffee creeping under the door. Through the small window, he saw Robert already working in the corral, carrying hay and checking the automatic waterer. The morning sun painted everything with a golden light that seemed to come from a different world than the one Lucas knew. Lucas dressed quickly, still the same dirty clothes as they were the only ones he had, and ran outside. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Robert called out, smiling. "Want to help?" The following days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a routine that Lucas had never imagined possible. Robert never officially said that Lucas could stay, but he also never suggested that he should leave. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, they established a rhythm of life. Early breakfast in the kitchen, while Maria prepared sandwiches for work, animal care. Under Robert's supervision, family lunch with conversations about ranch plans, more afternoon work learning about cattle management, dinner with stories about Robert and Maria's past, and restorative sleep in the room that slowly began to feel like his own. Lucas discovered he had a natural talent with animals. They seemed to trust him instinctively, approaching when others kept their distance. He could notice when something was wrong. A cow limping almost imperceptibly, another with slightly reduced appetite, subtle signs of illness or discomfort that even Robert sometimes missed. "The boy has an eye for cattle," Robert commented to Maria one night, watching through the kitchen window as Lucas sat on the fence, petting Star. "It's a gift. It's not something you teach." Star had become Lucas's special companion. She always ran to the fence when she saw him coming, and he always saved a handful of fresh grass or a piece of apple that Maria gave him. Sometimes, when the day's work was done and the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Lucas would sit on the fence and tell Star about his previous life on the streets, about the fears that still visited him in dreams, about the loneliness that had been his only constant companion. Star listened with her head tilted, her large dark eyes fixed on Lucas's face as if she understood every word. Sometimes she responded with a low moo, almost as if she were commenting. Lucas had begun to believe she really understood. "You talk too much to that heifer," Robert commented one day, approaching the fence where Lucas was explaining to Star how the irrigation system they had installed in the pasture worked. "She listens," said Lucas simply. "And what do you tell her?" Lucas thought for a moment. "Things. About how different it is here. About how I didn't know a place like this could exist." Robert felt something tighten in his chest. "And what else? That I want to take care of her forever. That I'll never let anything bad happen to her." It was at that moment that Robert felt the first real pang of guilt, because there was something he knew that Lucas didn't know yet, something he would eventually have to explain, something that would make the boy's world collapse again. But not today, Robert thought. Today, let the boy be happy. It was a December afternoon when Robert finally decided to plant the seed of knowledge that would grow until it became the most painful lesson of Lucas's life. They were fixing a fence in the north pasture when Robert, seemingly casually, petted a cow that approached looking for affection. "You know, Lucas," he said, his voice heavy with the wisdom of decades of experience, "there's a rule on the ranch that my boss taught me when I was younger than you." Lucas looked up from the wires he was helping to stretch. "What rule?" "Never name animals you're going to eat," said Robert, not looking directly at the boy. "Otherwise it gets hard when the time comes." Lucas laughed, a genuine and carefree laugh. "That's silly. Why would anyone want to eat an animal that has a name?" Robert felt a pang in his chest but kept his tone casual. "It's different when you're a rancher, boy. The job is to raise cattle to sell. That's how we make money." "But you don't sell the cows," said Lucas, confused. "They're all here. We sell some, and the calves, when they grow up." Robert hammered a nail with more force than necessary. "It's the cycle of the ranch." Lucas didn't ask any more questions, but something was whispering in the back of his mind, a small seed of discomfort that he couldn't name. The following months were the happiest of Lucas's life. He grew a few inches, gained weight, and his skin acquired the healthy tan of someone who works under the sun. More importantly, he began to smile easily and laugh out loud when Robert told bad jokes during work. Maria taught him to cook rice without burning it, to sew loose buttons, and to read the hardest words. In the newspaper that Robert brought from town every week, Robert taught him about pasture rotation, about how to identify poisonous plants, about the signs that indicated when a cow was about to give birth. But it was Star who taught Lucas about unconditional love. The heifer had grown quickly, transforming into an elegant and curious young cow that followed Lucas around the ranch when he allowed it. She had developed the habit of waiting for him near the fence every morning and greeting him with a cheerful moo that sounded almost like hello in the particular language they had developed. Lucas had taught Star some simple tricks using pieces of apple as rewards. She knew to come when he whistled, knew to stand still when he asked, and even knew how to shake hands, although this involved her lifting one of her front hooves in a somewhat clumsy way that always made Lucas laugh. "She's the smartest cow I've ever seen," commented the veterinarian Dr. Santos during one of his monthly visits. "And the most attached to humans. It's almost like she's a big dog." "She's special," said Lucas proudly, scratching Star behind the ears the way she liked best. "She really is," agreed Dr. Santos. "Too bad that—" "Too bad what?" asked Lucas. Dr. Santos looked at Robert, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Nothing," said the veterinarian quickly. "Too bad not all of them are so gentle." But Lucas had caught something in the exchange of glances between the two men. Silent communication that excluded him, a tension he couldn't decipher. It was in January, almost 5 months after Lucas's arrival, that the truth finally came out. Robert had postponed this conversation as long as possible. He had invented excuses, had found reasons to wait one more day, one more week. But Star was reaching ideal weight, and other ranchers had already asked about the availability of heifers of her quality. There was no more avoiding it. It was a hot, humid afternoon when Robert finally sat down with Lucas on the porch, 2 cold bottles on the table between them. Dr. Pepper for Lucas, beer for Robert. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and distant thunder echoed like war drums on the horizon. "I need to tell you something important," Robert began, choosing words as if each one could explode in his hands. "About the animals. About our ranch." Lucas watched him, feeling a strange cold in his stomach, despite the stifling heat of the afternoon. There was something in Robert's tone that reminded him of other bad moments in his life, moments when adults used that special voice before saying things that changed everything. "You know we raise cattle, right? Cows and steers?" "Yes. And you know why we raise cattle?" Lucas shook his head, although part of him already knew, a part he had tried to ignore during all these months. The same part that had felt uncomfortable when Robert mentioned the rule about not naming animals. "For meat, Lucas. The..." Words came out like heavy stones. "To feed people in the city. That's how we make money, how we pay the bills, how we buy food for our table." The world seemed to tilt, as if the ground under Lucas's feet had turned to quicksand. He felt like he had been punched in the stomach, all the air fleeing from his lungs at once. "Star too?" he asked in a small voice, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. Robert nodded slowly, each movement of his head like a hammer blow. "Star too? In a few weeks when she's the right size." "No!" The word exploded from Lucas like a cry of pain. He stood up abruptly, the plastic chair scraping on the wooden porch floor with a sound that seemed to come from far away. "She's my friend. You can't." "Lucas!" Robert tried to extend his hand, but the boy pulled away as if he had been burned. "You lied to me." Tears were already running down Lucas's face, hot and salty. "You said she was special." "And she is special," said Robert, standing up too, his own voice heavy with a pain he hadn't expected to feel. "But that's life on the ranch, son. We have to be practical. Remember the rule I told you about? Never name animals you're going to eat. It's the first rule." But Lucas was already running, tears burning his eyes, his heart beating like an uncontrolled drum that threatened to explode in his chest. He ran to the corral where Star was peacefully grazing, oblivious to the fate that awaited her. "I won't let this happen," he murmured, hugging the warm, familiar neck of the young cow. Star responded to the embrace in her own way, pressing her head against Lucas's chest and emitting a low, consoling moo. "I'll find a way. I promise." That night, Lucas barely touched the food that Maria had prepared with such care. Robert and Maria exchanged worried glances across the table, silence weighing between them like a storm cloud. "He'll understand," said Maria softly, after Lucas retired to his room. "It's a hard lesson, but necessary." "I know," replied Robert, but his voice carried no conviction. "It's just that, look how he loves that heifer, how she loves him." "That's exactly why you should do it soon," said Maria, touching her husband's hand. "The longer it takes, the more it will hurt." In the following days, Lucas became obsessive in his research. He asked Robert to take him to the town library, where he spent hours reading about cattle raising, about alternative methods, about ranches that worked differently. "There are people who raise cows just for milk," he said one night at dinner, his voice heavy with desperate hope. "They don't have to kill anyone. It requires a lot of investment, Lucas," Robert explained patiently, feeling each word like a betrayal. "Expensive equipment, refrigeration system, daily transport. It's not that simple. And what do you do with old cows that don't produce milk anymore? They live until they die of old age," said Lucas with conviction. "Like people." Robert sighed. "Lucas, son, the world doesn't work that way. If it were that easy, everyone would do it." "What if it were possible?" insisted Lucas, his eyes shining with an intensity that made Robert uncomfortable. "If you could make money without killing the cows, would you do it?" Robert looked at the boy for a long moment, seeing the passion burning in his eyes like a flame that refused to be extinguished. It was the same determination he himself had felt decades ago when he dreamed of having his own ranch. If it were economically viable. Of course, Lucas, but that's a very big if. It was this conversation that planted the seed of an idea that would grow in the coming years. But first, Lucas would have to learn the most painful lesson of his life. The day came on a February morning that dawned cloudy and heavy. Robert had postponed as long as possible, but the buyers were waiting, and Star had reached perfect weight. The time had come. Lucas woke up knowing there was nothing different about the house, no visual sign, but there was something in the air, a tension, a sadness that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Robert was drinking coffee in the kitchen, but he wasn't eating, and his hands trembled slightly as he brought the cup to his lips. "Is it today?" asked Lucas, his voice coming out as a whisper. Robert nodded, unable to look at the boy. "The truck arrives at 10. Lucas ran to the corral. Star was there, grazing peacefully under the morning sun that had finally broken through the clouds. When she saw him, she ran to the fence as she always did, looking for the morning affection and maybe a piece of apple. "Hi, girl," said Lucas, his voice breaking. "I came to say goodbye." But the words were too difficult. Instead of speaking, Lucas simply hugged Star's neck and cried. He cried for all the plans he had made for the two of them, for all the conversations they would never have again, for all the injustice of a world where love wasn't enough to protect those you loved. Star seemed to sense his anguish. She pressed her head against Lucas's chest and emitted a low, sad moo, as if she were trying to console him. When the truck arrived, a large, noisy vehicle that smelled of diesel and fear, Lucas couldn't watch. He stayed locked in his room, covering his ears so he wouldn't hear the sound of Star's hooves hitting the metal ramp as she was led inside. Robert tried to talk to him through the door. "Lucas, son, open the door. Let's talk. You killed my friend?" Lucas shouted, his voice muffled by the pillow. "You killed her. She'll have a good life until the end," Robert said, his own words sounding empty even to him. "It's the natural cycle of life, Lucas. That's how the world works." But Lucas could only think that he had failed Star, that he had promised to protect her and couldn't keep his promise. That night, Robert found Lucas sitting on the empty fence where Star used to stay, looking at the stars that shone with cruel clarity in the cloudless sky. "I know it's hurting," said Robert, sitting beside him on the rough wood. "It hurt me too the first time. When you were a child. I was 9. It was a calf named Bull. I had taught him to come when I whistled." Robert sighed, a long exhalation that carried decades of regret. "My boss told me the same thing I told you. Never name animals you're going to eat. But sometimes, Lucas, naming things is what makes us human." Lucas looked at him, surprised by this admission. "What do you mean?" "When you name something, you're recognizing that that life has unique value, that it means something, that it has a story, a personality, a soul." Robert placed his hand on Lucas's shoulder. "That doesn't make you weak, it makes you responsible." "Responsible for what?" "For finding better ways to do things." This conversation changed something fundamental in Lucas. Instead of pulling away from the animals as Robert expected, he drew even closer, but now with a different, more urgent purpose. He began to observe everything with a scientist's eyes, how the cows interacted with each other, what stressed them, what calmed them, how different treatments affected their behavior and health. He noticed that cows that received more attention and affection seemed healthier, that stressed animals got sick more frequently, that soft music during milking of the few dairy cows, they had increased production. "Why are you writing all this down?" asked Maria one day, seeing Lucas scribbling observations in a notebook he had asked for in town. "To remember," he said without looking up, "for when I'm grown up." "And what will you do when you're grown up?" Lucas stopped writing and looked out the kitchen window at the fields where the herd grazed peacefully. "I'm going to find a way to be a rancher without hurting anyone." Maria smiled, thinking it was just a child's dream. But Robert, who had heard the conversation from the living room, was thoughtful. There was a determination in Lucas's voice that he recognized, the same determination that had taken Robert off the streets decades ago and that had built this ranch brick by brick. The years passed like pages of a book being turned by the wind. Lucas grew strong and tall, his muscles developed by hard work on the ranch, and his mind sharpened by constant observation. He became indispensable to Robert, able to identify problems in the herd before even the veterinarian, to predict weather changes by the animal's behavior, to handle cattle with a gentleness that resulted in less stress and better results. But he never lost his obsession with finding alternatives. At 16, he began working part-time at the town feed store to save his own money. At 18, with the reluctant but proud support of Robert and Maria, he enrolled in animal science at Texas A&M University. "You're going to study to be a better rancher than me," Robert joked on the day of departure, but there was something melancholic in his voice. "I'm going to study to be a different kind of rancher," Lucas corrected, and this time Robert didn't doubt he would succeed. The university was a revelation. Lucas studied animal welfare, sustainable production systems, the growing market for ethically produced animal products. He discovered that his intuitive observations had solid scientific basis and that there was a whole worldwide movement in the direction he had imagined alone. But it was in a rural economics class that Lucas faced his biggest intellectual challenge. Professor Thompson was a pragmatic 60-year-old man, white hair and thick glasses, who had dedicated his life to teaching young idealists about the brutal realities of agribusiness. When Lucas presented his project on ethical ranches, the professor confronted him with merciless data. "Mr. Lucas," he said, adjusting his glasses, "your numbers are poetic but unrealistic. The cost of maintaining an animal until natural death multiplies the investment by 5. The return on artisanal dairy farming is marginal. And explain to me, what do you do with bulls? They don't produce milk." Lucas felt blood rise to his face, but forced himself to stay calm. "Professor, you're calculating only direct financial return. You're not considering added value, rural tourism, differentiated marketing, and mainly the change in consumer market." "Ah, yes," said the professor with irony. "The conscious consumer who will pay 3 times more for happy meat. What percentage of the American population has that purchasing power, Mr. Lucas?" "For now, few," admitted Lucas. "But niche markets can be extremely lucrative, and trends start in niches before becoming mainstream." The debate lasted 40 minutes. Lucas presented case studies from Europe, data on organic market growth, research on consumer willingness to pay more for ethical products. The professor counterattacked with economic realities, market pressures, operational costs. In the end, Professor Thompson leaned back in his chair. "Interesting, Mr. Lucas, very interesting. Your proposal is technically viable, although economically risky." He paused. "But there's a problem you didn't address." "Which one?" "Do you have the courage to bet your financial life on this? Because that's what you're proposing. Betting everything on a paradigm shift that might not happen at the speed you imagine." Lucas didn't hesitate. "I do." During breaks, he returned home loaded with ideas and experiments. He started small, implementing management techniques that reduced herd stress, introducing natural supplements that improved animal health, testing pasture rotation systems that benefited both cattle and soil. Robert watched with growing interest. Lucas's methods not only kept the animals healthier and happier, but were also resulting in better weight gain and greater disease resistance. This translated into higher profits, even with the additional investment in care. "The boy might be right," Robert commented to Maria one night after reviewing the ranch numbers. "The animals are more productive. We spend less on veterinary bills, and the meat quality has improved. But we're still selling for slaughter," Maria pointed out. "For now," said Robert thoughtfully. "For now." It was in his last year of college that Lucas finally presented his complete proposal. He arrived for December break, carrying folders, charts, spreadsheets, and a 50-page business plan that had been his thesis. "I want to transform our ranch," he said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "Not into a romantic sanctuary, but into a sustainable business that proves it's possible to raise animals ethically and profit from it." Robert studied the numbers, impressed with the level of detail in the research. There were market analyses, financial projections, feasibility studies, implementation schedules. "You want to end slaughter?" asked Robert. "I want to drastically reduce and eventually eliminate it," said Lucas. "We'll specialize in breeding and selling animals to other ranches that want to adopt humane methods. We'll have an educational program to receive visitors. We'll have a small production of artisanal dairy from happy cows, and we'll document everything." "Document?" Lucas smiled. "Internet, Dad. Social media. People want to know where their food comes from, how animals are treated. There's a huge market for transparency. Robert flipped through the pages, doing mental calculations. Will this work? It's already working in other places, said Lucas, excited. There are ranches in Europe and the United States that have been doing this for years. And there's a growing market here in America for ethical products. People are willing to pay more when they know the animals were well treated. Maria, who had listened to everything while preparing dinner, approached the table. And the old animals? The cows that don't produce milk anymore? What happens to them? Lucas smiled, the same expression he had when he named Star. They live until they die naturally. They become ranch mascots. Children love meeting elderly cows. Robert was silent for a long moment, looking at the papers, mentally reliving all the years since he found Lucas at the farmer's market. Finally, he raised his eyes to the young man. When do you want to start? The transformation didn't happen overnight. Lucas knew that radical changes frighten people, so he implemented his innovations gradually, carefully testing each new approach before expanding. First, he installed cameras in the corrals to monitor animal behavior in real time. Then, he introduced ambient music during rest hours. He discovered that classical music and jazz calmed the herd, while rock increased stress. He implemented an environmental enrichment system with toys and obstacles that stimulated the cattle's natural curiosity. Posts with brushes for the cows to scratch themselves, suspended hay, bowls for play, different floor textures for natural hoof massage. You're wasting money, Robert grumbled at first, seeing Lucas install a water fountain with different levels to stimulate the animal's interest. I'm investing in the product, Lucas corrected. Look how much more active they are, more curious. Stimulated cows are healthy cows. Results began to appear within weeks. The herd became visibly calmer, more sociable. Disease incidents dropped dramatically. The milk quality from the few dairy cows they had improved noticeably. But the turning point came when Lucas decided to document everything on social media. Day 127 of the Happy Cows project, he said to his phone camera, walking through the pasture where the herd grazed peacefully. Look how relaxed they are. There's no stress, no fear. They know they're safe. He showed the cows voluntarily approaching when he called, playing with the hay balls, resting in the shade of trees he had planted specifically for their comfort. Many people think farm animals don't have feelings, he continued, petting a cow that had approached the camera. But look into her eyes. You see personality, curiosity, even a sense of humor. Each one has her own way of being. The first video got a few hundred views. The second reached 1,000, but it was the third video that changed everything forever. Lucas was filming the morning routine when something extraordinary happened. One of the older cows, Princess, daughter of the old Mocha, approached a calf that had separated from the group and was crying in distress. Princess gently guided the calf back near its mother, licking its head in a clearly consoling gesture. You just saw compassion, said Lucas to the camera, his voice heavy with genuine emotion. An adult cow consoling a baby that isn't even her own child. Tell me that isn't love. The video went viral. In a week, it had 2 million views. In a month, Lucas had 300,000 followers. Messages arrived by the thousands. People sharing their own stories with animals. Other ranchers interested in learning his methods. Animal rights activists praising his approach. But it was one specific message that impacted Lucas the most. It was from a woman in Dallas who wrote, "My 6-year-old son watches your videos every day. Yesterday he told me that when he grows up, he wants to be a happy cow rancher like you. Thank you for showing that it's possible to raise animals with love." Lucas showed the message to Robert, who was repairing a nearby fence. The older man read in silence, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Remember when you told me that naming things makes us responsible?" asked Lucas. Robert nodded. "Now I understand what you meant. When you recognize that a life has value, you become responsible for protecting that life. And when you protect one life, you're protecting all lives." Robert smiled, proud. "And when you protect all lives, you're protecting your own." The ranch was completely transformed in the following months. With money coming in from sponsored videos, rural tourism visits, and sales of artisanal products, Lucas built educational trails, a small but well-equipped visitor center, and even a store where he sold cheese and sweets made with milk from the happy cows. Families came from neighboring cities on weekends to meet the animals and learn about sustainable agriculture. Children ran among the gentle cows, learning their names and personalities. Adults left with a new understanding of where their food comes from. The cows themselves seemed to understand they were special. They posed for photos with visitors. Some even learned simple tricks that Lucas had taught using positive reinforcement. The ranch became a regional tourist attraction and a model for other properties. Universities began sending students for internships. The government offered incentives for expansion. Other ranchers asked for consultancy. "You did it," said Robert one afternoon, watching a group of children feeding the cows with grass under Maria's supervision. "You proved it's possible." "We did it," Lucas corrected. "If you hadn't given me a chance at the farmer's market that day, if you hadn't had the courage to try something different," Robert countered. "The world is full of people with good intentions, Lucas. But you had the courage to turn intention into action." But the most emotional moment was yet to come. It was an autumn afternoon, almost 10 years after that first morning at the farmer's market, when Lucas saw an unfamiliar pickup truck parking in front of the house. A young man got out, carrying a child, a boy of maybe 4 years old, too thin, with clean but simple clothes and large, cautious eyes that Lucas recognized immediately. "Are you Lucas?" asked the man. "The one from YouTube." Lucas nodded, approaching. He was now 28 years old, tanned by the sun and with hands calloused from working the land, but his eyes maintained the same gentleness that Robert had seen in that 8-year-old boy at the farmer's market. "I'm a coordinator at a shelter in Dallas," explained the man. "This is Jake. He's been through a lot. Hasn't talked much since he came to us, his parents. Anyway, it was a severe neglect situation. He was alone for weeks before someone reported it." Lucas felt something familiar stir in his chest, the painful memory of his own childhood, but also the hope that maybe he could make a difference. "He watches your videos constantly," continued the coordinator. "It's the only thing that seems to interest him. When we ask what he wants to do, he always says, 'See the happy cows.' So I thought maybe a visit could help." Lucas looked at the boy, recognizing something deeply familiar in his eyes, the same mixture of fear and hope that he himself had carried so many years ago, the same hunger that went far beyond an empty stomach. "Hi, Jake," said Lucas, softly, crouching to the child's height. "Want to meet the cows?" Jake nodded timidly. Lucas took him to the corral where Princess, now an elderly and respected matriarch of the herd, was grazing calmly alongside her youngest daughter, a 6-month-old calf that Lucas had named Hope. Princess approached the fence when she saw Lucas, as she always did. At 15 years old, she was the oldest cow on the ranch, a survivor from the old times who now lived her golden years in peace. "This is Princess," said Lucas. "She's like the grandmother of all the other cows here. She really likes children. Want to say hi to her?" Jake extended his small, hesitant hand. Princess sniffed his fingers and then licked his palm gently, exactly as Star had done with Lucas so many years before. The boy let out a little giggle, the first spontaneous sound he had made since they arrived. "Does she like me?" asked Jake, his voice small but clear. "She loves you," said Lucas, feeling tears prick his eyes. "Want to know something? When I was your age, I was just like you. I didn't have anyone to take care of me either, until I met a good man who brought me here, just like this gentleman brought you." Jake looked at Lucas with renewed interest. "And you know what I learned from the cows?" continued Lucas. "I learned that everyone deserves love, everyone deserves a second chance, and everyone deserves to have someone who cares about them." That afternoon, Jake talked more than he had talked in months. He wanted to know the name of each cow, wanted to understand why they were different from cows on normal ranches, wanted to know if he could come back to visit them. When it was time to leave, Jake hugged Lucas's leg tightly. "Will you take care of them?" he asked, the same question that carried the weight of his own abandoned story. "Always," promised Lucas, "and you can come back whenever you want." As the pickup truck drove away, Robert approached Lucas, who was still watching the dusty road. "Remember Star?" asked Robert. "Every day. She saved you, didn't she?" Lucas thought for a moment, watching Princess and Hope grazing side by side, 3 generations of love and care represented in their peaceful lives. "No," he said finally. "She taught me that saving is possible, that it's worth trying even when it seems impossible. Even when everyone says you're dreaming." Robert smiled. "And now you're saving others." Lucas looked around at the green fields where his cows grazed in peace at the house where Maria was preparing dinner, humming an old song, at the signs that announced Star Sanctuary, where every animal has a name and every life has value. "No," he said finally, "now I'm being saved by them. Every day." That night, Lucas recorded a new video, but this time it was different from the others. 10 years ago, he began, a rancher taught me that we should never name animals we're going to eat. He was right, but not for the reason he thought. When you name something, you recognize that that life has unique value, and when you recognize that a life has value, you become responsible for protecting it. He paused, looking at the camera with eyes shining with conviction. Today, every animal on this ranch has a name. Each one has a story. Each one has a second chance, and you know what? Naming things doesn't make you weak. Naming things makes you human. The video ended with Lucas walking through the pasture at sunset, surrounded by dozens of cows that followed him, as if he were the leader of a very special herd. And maybe that's exactly what he was. Above, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Lucas could swear that one of them, the brightest of all, was winking especially for him. A star that had taught an orphaned boy that love is the most revolutionary force in the world. If this story touched your heart as it touched mine, leave a like so more people can know about Lucas and Star's journey. In the comments, tell me, have you ever had a special animal in your life that changed your perspective on the world? Or maybe you know someone who, like Lucas, transformed pain into purpose. Your stories in the comments inspire other people and create a community of hope. And if you believe we need more stories like this, stories that show that kindness can revolutionize the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because when we share stories of transformation, we ourselves are transformed. And maybe, as Lucas discovered, naming the things we love doesn't make us weak. It makes us profoundly human. Until the next story that will touch your soul.